Mrs. Rosa Brown, a dignified elderly black woman with a long history in the community, navigated her aging sedan through the winding back roads of a small town in the Deep South. She had just finished her weekly grocery shopping, a routine she had maintained for years, and her thoughts were focused on the comfort of home and the dinner she planned to prepare, a meal that carried the warmth of family traditions passed down through generations. As she drove, the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the road. The tranquility of the evening was suddenly shattered by the piercing sound of a police siren. The abruptness of the noise startled Mrs. Brown, causing her heart to race. In her rearview mirror, she spotted the telltale flash of red and blue lights growing closer. Knowing there was no reason to fear but feeling the familiar tension that any encounter with law enforcement brought, she calmly pulled her car to the side of the road and came to a stop. Moments later, two white police officers emerged from their cruiser, their expressions stern and unreadable as they approached her vehicle. Mrs. Brown kept her hands firmly on the steering wheel, her mind racing with memories of stories she had heard over the years, stories of similar encounters that had not ended well for people who looked like her. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that she had done nothing wrong, and waited for what would come next. As the officers reached her car, their demeanor was cold and authoritative. Without so much as a greeting, they demanded her license and registration. The tone in their voices carried an undercurrent of disdain, as if they had already judged her solely based on her appearance. Mrs. Brown felt a knot tighten in her stomach, but she maintained her composure, handing over the requested documents with a steady hand. The situation quickly escalated as the officers began to question her in a manner that was not only disrespectful but laced with unnecessary aggression. They questioned why she was driving on that particular road at that time of day, their words dripping with suspicion. The implication was clear: they did not believe she had any legitimate reason to be there. Mrs. Brown, a woman who had lived through the civil rights movement and had seen more than her fair share of prejudice, knew this was more than just a routine traffic stop. This was an encounter steeped in the toxic remnants of racial bias that still lingered in the region. Despite the injustice she felt, Mrs. Brown remained calm, refusing to allow the officers to provoke her. But as their hostility grew, so did her resolve. She knew she could not let this treatment go unanswered. Drawing on the strength and wisdom she had cultivated over her many years, Mrs. Brown made a silent decision. This was where she would draw the line. After the officers finally allowed her to leave, she drove home in silence, her mind set on one thing. As soon as she stepped through her front door, she reached for the phone and called her son, a man who had inherited her sense of justice and determination. With a quiet but firm voice, she recounted the details of the traffic stop, not leaving out a single detail. Her son listened intently, anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. He knew the weight of his mother's words and understood the significance of the situation. It was time for action. That one phone call set off a chain of events that would forever alter the lives of those officers. What they had seen as a routine traffic stop, laced with casual cruelty, would soon become a turning point they could never have anticipated. Mrs. Brown's stand against the injustice she had faced was the catalyst for change, and the officers who had scorned her would soon learn that their actions had consequences far beyond what they had imagined. Mrs. Brown's hands gripped the steering wheel with a firm, resolute strength as she met the scornful, mocking gazes of those around her. This kind of situation was all too familiar. She had encountered similar disdain and judgment countless times throughout her life. Mrs. Rosa Brown, a woman who carried herself with a quiet dignity and an inner fortitude, was no stranger to adversity. At 75 years old, she had weathered more than her fair share of life's trials and triumphs, each one adding to the rich tapestry of her experiences. Rosa Brown's journey began in the early 1940s in a small, segregated town in the South, a place where racial tensions and social inequalities were ever present. From an early age, she exhibited an unbreakable spirit and a keen intellect that set her apart. Her parents, both dedicated schoolteachers, were her first role models. They instilled in her a profound respect for education and an unwavering commitment to standing up for what was just and right. Growing up, Rosa bore witness to the harsh realities of racial injustice that plagued her community, which only fueled her resolve to challenge the status quo. By the early 1960s, Rosa made a significant move to the north to pursue higher education. It was during these formative college years that she became deeply immersed in the burgeoning civil rights movement. Inspired by the powerful leadership of figures such as Martin Luther King Jr. and her namesake Rosa Parks, Rosa became an active participant in local activist groups. She engaged in numerous protests and sit-ins, risking her safety and comfort to fight for equality and civil rights. Her involvement was not just a passive endeavor. She played an instrumental role in organizing and mobilizing efforts that aimed to bring about tangible change. As the 1970s unfolded, Rosa Brown emerged as a prominent and influential figure in the ongoing struggle for civil rights. Her tireless dedication was evident in her work organizing voter registration drives in the South, where she was pivotal in registering thousands of new voters. Her efforts had a lasting impact on the political landscape, contributing to significant shifts in representation and policy that reflected the changing tides of the era. Rosa's professional achievements were deeply intertwined with her personal life. She married a fellow activist, sharing both a life and a mission dedicated to the pursuit of justice. Together, they raised a son, David, whom they nurtured with the same values of justice and equality that had guided their own lives. David grew up inspired by his mother's legacy and chose to follow in her footsteps by pursuing a career in public service. Even in retirement, Rosa remained a beacon of courage and commitment. Her legacy continued to shine through her unwavering dedication to the principles of justice and human rights. Her life was a testament to the power of perseverance and the impact one individual can have in the quest for a more equitable world. On that fateful afternoon, Mrs. Brown had no inkling that her rights were about to be trampled once more. As she drove down the road, her mind was on mundane matters until she noticed flashing lights behind her. Pulling over to the side, she watched through her rearview mirror as the young officer approached her car. His buzz cut and the smirk curling at the edge of his lips were unmistakable signs of arrogance. Trailing behind him was his partner, an older man with a grizzled beard that hinted at years of experience and, perhaps, a certain gruffness. The young officer, barely concealing his disdain, leaned towards Mrs. Brown as she rolled down her window. "What's the matter, Granny?" he taunted, his voice dripping with condescension. "Didn't you see the stop sign back there?" Mrs. Brown met his gaze with calm resolve, though she felt a sharp pang of irritation beneath her composure. She explained that the stop sign must have been obscured by overhanging tree branches. The young officer scoffed, his eyes narrowing with skepticism. "Yeah, I'm sure. You old folks always have an excuse for everything." Despite the sting of his words, Mrs. Brown's voice remained steady. She reiterated that it was an honest mistake. The older officer, who had been standing off to the side, now stepped forward and propped himself against the car. With a dismissive tone, he demanded, "License and registration." Mrs. Brown nodded and reached for her documents, handing them over with a grace born from years of dealing with similar situations. As the officers scrutinized her paperwork, they continued to make derisive remarks. The younger officer eyed her car with evident disdain. "This old clunker's seen better days," he remarked with a smirk. The older officer, not to be outdone, added with a chuckle, "It's probably held together with duct tape and prayers." Mrs. Brown's jaw tightened, but she chose silence over confrontation. The prejudice and disrespect she had faced throughout her life never seemed to get any easier, despite her vast experience in enduring it. As the officers strolled back to their patrol car, presumably to run her information through their system, Mrs. Brown watched them through the rearview mirror. Their animated conversation and occasional bursts of laughter felt like a personal affront. The minutes dragged on, each second stretching into what felt like an eternity. Mrs. Brown took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. She thought of her son David, who had always advised her to maintain her dignity and composure, regardless of the circumstances. In the face of this latest indignity, she clung to his words, determined to hold her head high and face this challenge with the same strength and grace he had taught her. The officers finally made their way back to Mrs. Brown's vehicle, the younger of the two still sporting that infuriating smirk that had been present since their initial interaction. He looked at her with a patronizing air and said, "Everything seems to be in order, but we're going to need to search your car." His tone was unmistakable, suggesting that this was not a request but a command, leaving no room for negotiation. Mrs. Brown, visibly distressed, questioned the necessity of the search. "Is that necessary?" she asked, her voice tinged with a mix of anxiety and frustration. The older officer, his expression devoid of any sympathy, replied with a dismissive shrug, "Just routine. Ma'am," he then added, "Step out of the vehicle, please." His authoritative tone brooked no argument. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 1 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. Reluctantly, Mrs. Brown complied and stepped out of her car. She stood by, feeling increasingly uneasy as the officers began their invasive inspection. They started to rummage through her personal belongings with a sense of entitlement, their actions marked by a casual disregard for her privacy. As they sifted through her things, their laughter and derisive remarks filled the air, adding to her growing discomfort. Despite their thorough search, they found nothing of concern. Nevertheless, their behavior was designed to belittle her and make her feel insignificant. While going through her groceries, one of the officers retrieved a loaf of bread and held it aloft, making a show of his discovery. "What's this?" "Your dinner," he asked mockingly, his laughter echoing with derision. Mrs. Brown's patience was rapidly wearing thin. She replied curtly that it was indeed her dinner. In response, the young officer tossed the loaf of bread towards her with a sneer. Rosa fumbled to catch it, but her attempt was clumsy. The bread slipped through her grasp, and in her struggle to regain balance, she fell hard onto the concrete. The impact on her tailbone was sharp and painful enough to draw a scream from her lips. Within moments, both officers loomed over her, their hands resting ominously on their batons. "What are you screaming for, old hag?" the older officer barked, his voice harsh and unfeeling. The young officer's amusement only intensified as he observed her close to tears. However, his mirth quickly faded when he noticed a family approaching on the opposite side of the street. He grabbed his partner's arm and subtly nodded toward the onlookers, signaling the need to wrap things up. The older officer, visibly irritated, rolled his eyes and said, "Well, it looks like you're free to go. Just make sure to be more careful with those stop signs next time." His words dripped with sarcasm, and his mocking smile lingered as he and his partner returned to their patrol car, leaving Mrs. Brown standing alone, humiliated and in pain. Officers Tom Harris and Jake Miller, two men whose lives had intertwined in the shared tapestry of their small southern hometown, had spent their entire lives in an environment where the remnants of segregation still echoed. The town, nestled in the deep South, was a place where outdated prejudices stubbornly lingered, and deeply ingrained racist attitudes were not only common but openly endorsed and passed down through generations. Tom Harris, the older of the two men, was a burly figure in his late 40s, whose imposing presence was matched by his long-standing commitment to the local police force. His entry into law enforcement had been a continuation of a family tradition, following in the footsteps of his father and grandfather, both of whom had also served as police officers in the same town. Harris took great pride in upholding what he perceived as the traditional values of his community, clinging to an outdated sense of nostalgia for a bygone era. He often reflected on what he considered the good old days. During evenings spent at the local bar, a place adorned with Confederate flags and filled with the familiar sounds of racist jokes and bigoted banter. Over the years, persistent rumors had circulated about Harris's affiliations with racist groups and individuals. Although he had never been directly caught engaging in any overtly illegal activities, there was a well-documented pattern of him attending clandestine meetings and rallies, often held under the cover of darkness. Such activities fueled a growing sense of unease within the Black community, who viewed him with a palpable mix of fear and resentment. They were acutely aware that any interaction with Harris had the potential to escalate into a perilous situation. Harris wielded his badge not just as a symbol of law enforcement, but as a weapon of intimidation, using it to mask and perpetuate his discriminatory behavior with an air of unwarranted superiority. Jake Miller was in his mid-30s, carrying with him a background as tumultuous as it was troubling. His early years were marked by instability and conflict, a time when he frequently found himself embroiled in fights and confrontations with the law. His academic performance was lackluster at best, barely securing his high school diploma. After graduation, he meandered through a string of unremarkable, dead-end jobs, each one offering little in terms of fulfillment or direction. It was during this period of drifting that Harris, a family friend with a well-established position on the police force, extended a lifeline to Miller. Harris helped him secure a spot at the police academy, viewing it as an opportunity to turn his life around. For Miller, joining the police force was more than just a career move. It was a chance to assert control and gain the respect that had eluded him throughout his troubled youth. He saw law enforcement as a means to wield power and assert dominance in ways he had never before been able to. Miller idolized Harris, who had become a mentor figure in his life. Unfortunately, he also adopted many of Harris's more troubling attitudes, including a deep-seated racism that Harris had cultivated over years of service. Miller quickly gained a reputation for his aggressive policing style, particularly in the town's predominantly Black neighborhoods. His approach was often heavy-handed and confrontational, fueled by an underlying prejudice that mirrored his mentor's. Rumors circulated about Miller's connections to racist groups, and unlike Harris, he was less skilled at concealing his affiliations. His comments were often laced with thinly veiled threats and discriminatory remarks, making his biases and prejudices glaringly obvious. His brash demeanor and quick temper earned him a reputation as a feared and loathed figure among the town's minority communities. On the day they pulled over Rosa Brown, neither Miller nor his partner anticipated anything out of the ordinary. To them, Rosa was merely another Black woman to be subjected to their disdain and scorn. As they approached her car, they were confident in their ability to assert their authority, laughing and joking among themselves about the encounter. Their actions that day, however, would set in motion a series of events that neither could have foreseen. The encounter with Rosa would not only bring their misconduct to light, but would also challenge and confront the very core of their deeply entrenched beliefs and attitudes. As the officers finally drove away, Rosa quickly retreated to the sanctuary of her car, locking the doors with a sense of urgency. Her hands trembled slightly as she watched their patrol car recede in the rearview mirror. The sting of their cruel words and the humiliation from earlier remained etched in her mind. The memory of tripping and falling, followed by the officers encircling her as she lay on the ground, was still vivid and unsettling. The fear she had felt in those moments made her hands shake as she tried to compose herself. Determined to seek support and advice, Rosa fumbled through her bag for her phone, her movements hurried and anxious. After finally finding it, she dialed her son David's number, her heart pounding in her chest. David's voice, full of concern and immediate reassurance, came through almost instantly. His first question was whether she was okay. "David, I just had an encounter with some police officers," Rosa began, her voice quivering despite her efforts to remain steady. "They stopped me for a minor traffic violation and were incredibly disrespectful. I'm still here on the side of the road, and they're just sitting next to their car, drinking sodas. I'm watching them through my rearview mirror." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line as David processed the situation. He quickly asked for her exact location. "I'm near the corner of Elm Street and Maple Avenue," Rosa replied, trying to keep her voice as steady as possible. David assured her that she should stay put and not move. He promised to handle the situation and to call her back within a few minutes. Hearing his confident and caring response, Rosa felt a wave of relief wash over her. She knew that her son would take action to address the situation and ensure her safety. As she ended the call, Rosa took a deep breath and sat in her car, trying to calm her nerves. The incident replayed in her mind, each detail feeling more intense as she recalled the officer's behavior and her vulnerability. While waiting for David's call, she focused on grounding herself, drawing strength from the knowledge that she was not alone and that her son was on his way to help. David Brown was a man deeply guided by a strict code of justice and integrity, principles that had been ingrained in him from an early age by his mother, Rosa. Rosa's unwavering commitment to these values shaped David's character and outlook on life. From his childhood, David had been taught that standing up for what was right was not just a moral obligation but a way of life, even when it was fraught with difficulty or danger. This upbringing instilled in him a strong sense of morality and an unshakable belief in the power and necessity of justice. Upon completing his education, David pursued a career in public service, driven by his passion for law and order. He was acutely aware of the imperfections within the justice system, its susceptibility to corruption, abuse of power, and discrimination, particularly against people of color. These issues troubled him deeply and fueled his resolve to effect meaningful change. Determined to address these flaws and contribute to a more just society, David chose to become a federal prosecutor. Throughout his career, David built a formidable reputation for being both tough and fair. His approach to law enforcement was marked by a relentless pursuit of justice. He was known for taking on cases that others shied away from, whether because they were deemed too challenging or too controversial. David's tenacity and refusal to tolerate abuses of power set him apart. He was dedicated to holding those who misused their authority accountable, regardless of their position or influence. This unwavering commitment earned him the respect of his colleagues and the fear of those who found themselves on the wrong side of the law. David's inspiration and driving force had always been his mother. Rosa Brown's activism during the civil rights movement left an indelible mark on David. Her courageous efforts and steadfast commitment to fighting for equality and justice profoundly influenced him. Her stories of struggle and perseverance shaped his worldview and fueled his determination to carry forward her legacy. David saw his work as a way of honoring Rosa's sacrifices and continuing her vital contributions to the fight for civil rights. Through his actions, he aimed to uphold the principles she had championed and make a lasting impact on the quest for justice. When David received his mother's call, he immediately felt a surge of anger. The thought of anyone disrespecting her, especially officers of the law, was intolerable. He knew he needed to act quickly, not just to protect his mother but to ensure that those responsible were held accountable. David's mind began to race as he considered his options. He knew that the local authorities might not take the incident seriously, especially in a town with a history of racial bias. But David had connections, and he wasn't afraid to use them. He quickly contacted a colleague at the Department of Justice who specialized in civil rights cases. Within minutes, David was on the phone with federal agents, explaining the situation and emphasizing the urgency of the matter. He requested that a team be sent to investigate the officer's conduct and promised to provide any assistance needed to ensure a thorough investigation. The agents assured him they would act swiftly, David then called his mother back to reassure her that help was on the way. When David arrived at the scene, Mrs. Brown's eyes filled with tears of relief. David hugged her and promised to see that justice would be served. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 2 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. When David received the call from his mother, a tidal wave of anger surged through him. The very thought of anyone showing disrespect towards her, particularly law enforcement officers, was utterly unacceptable. The injustice she had experienced fueled a fierce determination within him. He understood that he had to act swiftly, not only to safeguard his mother but to ensure that those responsible faced the consequences of their actions. David's mind raced as he weighed his options. He was acutely aware that in a town with a history steeped in racial bias, the local authorities might be inclined to dismiss or downplay the incident. The thought of his mother's distress being met with indifference from the local police only intensified his resolve. Fortunately, David had connections that could provide leverage. Without hesitation, he reached out to a trusted colleague at the Department of Justice, someone with a specialization in civil rights cases. Within minutes of hanging up, David was engaged in a critical conversation with federal agents. He meticulously outlined the details of the situation, stressing the gravity and urgency of the matter. David requested the immediate dispatch of a team to investigate the officer's conduct, ensuring that the probe would be thorough and impartial. The federal agents, recognizing the seriousness of the allegations, assured David of their swift action and promised to keep him updated throughout the process. After securing a commitment from the Department of Justice, David called his mother back. He spoke with calm assurance, informing her that help was on the way and that the situation was being taken very seriously. Her audible sigh of relief was a small comfort, but it did little to ease the tension that had built up inside him. When David arrived at his mother's home, he was met with a poignant scene. Mrs. Brown's eyes were brimming with tears of relief as she saw her son. David enveloped her in a heartfelt embrace, his own eyes moist with emotion. He spoke to her with earnest conviction, promising that he would pursue justice with unwavering dedication. His assurance provided a glimmer of hope amid a difficult and unsettling time, as he resolved to see that those responsible for the wrongdoing would be held accountable. The officers' faces drained of color as they recognized who stood before them. Senator David Brown, a man of considerable power and influence, was not only a prominent political figure but also Rosa Brown's son. The realization that they were now facing someone of his stature caused their expressions to shift from casual confidence to sheer apprehension. They stood there, ashen-faced and visibly shaken, understanding that they had crossed a line that could have serious repercussions. Senator David Brown, his presence commanding and his authority unmistakable, turned to address the officers directly. "Officers," he began, his voice carrying an unmistakable edge of authority, "I believe we need to have a serious discussion about how you treated my mother." His tone was resolute, leaving no room for misinterpretation of his intent. The officers' anxiety deepened as they absorbed the gravity of the situation. Senator Brown was well known for his steadfast commitment to justice and equality, and his reputation for holding individuals accountable was well earned. The officers began to stammer and offer feeble explanations, trying to downplay the incident by insisting that they meant no harm. Their attempts to mitigate the situation only seemed to heighten their discomfort. "That's not what it looks like to me," Senator Brown replied sharply, his eyes narrowing as he spoke. "Mocking and disrespecting an elderly woman is harmful, regardless of any claimed intent. Did you or did you not cause her to fall, and then stand over her instead of offering assistance?" His words were pointed and unyielding. "Your behavior was unacceptable, and it will not go unaddressed." The weight of his words hung heavily in the air. The officers, already unnerved, could do little more than acknowledge their transgressions. Senator Brown's insistence on accountability was clear, and the consequences of their actions were now very real. The incident had not only exposed their misconduct but also brought them face to face with the undeniable authority of someone who would not allow such behavior to go unchallenged. The officers stood there, a palpable silence hanging in the air as they absorbed the gravity of the situation. The smugness that had marked their earlier demeanor had vanished, replaced by a heavy sense of shame. They knew there was nothing they could say to undo their actions or to erase the impact of their behavior. Senator Brown, having arrived on the scene with his usual poise, turned to his mother with a reassuring smile. "Let's get you home, Mom. You've had a long day," he said softly. Mrs. Brown, feeling a wave of gratitude for her son's presence and his swift intervention, nodded in agreement. As they walked toward the SUV, she took one last glance at the officers. Their earlier mockery and disdain had given way to a sobering awareness of the consequences of their conduct. Mr. Coolidge, who had been standing off to the side, lingered for a moment, making sure the officers fully grasped the seriousness of their actions. With a firm and authoritative tone, he addressed them, "I trust you'll think twice before treating anyone with such disrespect again. Senator Brown will be expecting a full report on this incident, and that includes all footage from your body cams." The officers, now visibly uncomfortable, nodded in acknowledgement. Mr. Coolidge's words carried a weight of authority that underscored the importance of accountability and respect in law enforcement. As the senator and his mother drove away, the scene behind them remained marked by the uneasy silence of those who had been reminded of their professional obligations and the consequences of failing to uphold them. As the sleek black SUV glided into Mrs. Brown's driveway, a palpable sense of relief began to wash over the day's earlier stress. Senator David Brown, ever attentive and protective, carefully assisted his mother out of the vehicle, ensuring she was steady on her feet. "Thank you, David," Mrs. Brown said, her voice tinged with gratitude and fatigue. "I don't know what I would have done without you today." David offered her a reassuring smile, wrapping his arm gently around her shoulders. "Never worry, Mom," he said softly. "I'll always be here for you." While Mrs. Brown took a moment to unwind from the harrowing day, David took out his phone to address the situation. He dialed a number and, once connected, spoke with measured resolve. "Mr. Coolidge, thank you once again for your assistance today," he began. "I need to emphasize the importance of ensuring that the officers involved in this incident are held accountable for their actions. This matter must be taken seriously." The repercussions of the incident involving Rosa Brown unfolded rapidly and decisively. The news of the mistreatment faced by the mother of a distinguished U.S. senator ignited a firestorm of public outrage. The local authorities found themselves under intense scrutiny as the story gained traction. Media outlets reported extensively on the case, amplifying the public's indignation and fueling demands for justice. Civil rights organizations quickly mobilized, adding their voices to the chorus of condemnation. Their pressure, combined with the media spotlight, left the town's leaders with no option but to act. The incident's fallout was swift and severe, with a broad call for accountability reverberating through the community and beyond. The authorities were compelled to address the situation with the seriousness it deserved, as the eyes of the nation were firmly fixed on the unfolding developments. The police department initiated an internal investigation, placing officers Tom Harris and Jake Miller on administrative leave while the inquiry unfolded. As the investigation progressed, it uncovered a deeply troubling pattern of misconduct that extended well beyond the incident involving Rosa. The probe revealed that Harris and Miller had been involved in a persistent and systematic campaign of harassment, intimidation, and racial profiling, targeting Black residents over many years. Numerous testimonies from members of the Black community came to light, painting a damning portrait of the officers' behavior. Accounts of repeated encounters with Harris and Miller described not just isolated incidents of misconduct, but a pervasive culture of racism and abuse within the department. The evidence collected was overwhelming and conclusive, illustrating that the problem was far from being an isolated occurrence. It was clear that the misconduct was symptomatic of a broader, entrenched issue within the police force. Both officers were summoned to a disciplinary hearing, a high-stakes proceeding that brought together a panel of senior officials and representatives from the community. The atmosphere was charged with tension as Harris and Miller faced scrutiny and judgment. Harris, known for his usual confidence and defiant demeanor, appeared visibly shaken for the first time. The gravity of the charges and the potential damage to his career were becoming all too real. Miller, who had always admired and followed Harris's example, was equally apprehensive. The realization that their badges could no longer shield them from accountability was a harsh and sobering reality. The hearing was a pivotal moment, exposing the deep-seated issues within the department and marking a significant step towards addressing the systemic racism and misconduct that had plagued the community for years. The outcome of the hearing would not only determine the fate of Harris and Miller, but also signal a broader commitment to reform and justice within the police department. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 3 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. The hearing culminated in a unanimous verdict that left no room for doubt. Officers Tom Harris and Jake Miller were found guilty of gross misconduct, abuse of power, and violating the civil rights of numerous citizens. The panel's decision was resolute and unyielding. Both officers were terminated from the police force with immediate effect. Additionally, the panel strongly recommended the revocation of their law enforcement certifications, effectively dismantling their careers in policing. The reaction from Harris and Miller was a tumultuous blend of shock, anger, and denial. Harris, who had long prided himself on his untouchable status within the department, was consumed by a seething rage. He felt betrayed by the very system he had once manipulated to his advantage. In his view, the hearing was an act of retribution, a way to make him a scapegoat for broader systemic issues he believed were beyond his control. Despite his vocal protestations, a deeper, unsettling truth lingered within him. His unchecked power and impunity had finally been stripped away. The prospect of losing the authority he had wielded so recklessly was a harsh and unpalatable reality. Miller's reaction was marked by a profound lack of composure. Overcome by the weight of the verdict and the implications for his future, he broke down during the hearing. His expression of regret was tinged with a palpable sense of resentment. The finality of the decision, coupled with the loss of his job, represented not just the end of his professional career, but the erosion of his identity and sense of purpose. For Miller, the future seemed shrouded in uncertainty and despair as he grappled with the harsh reality of his new, bleak circumstances. The consequences of Harris and Miller's actions were far-reaching, extending well beyond the immediate loss of their jobs. Their names and faces quickly became fixtures in news reports, plastered across television screens and front pages alike. The scandal cast a long shadow over their lives, transforming them into social pariahs within their community. As public outrage intensified, their former colleagues and acquaintances, once close, began to distance themselves. Old friendships dissolved, and people who had once looked up to them now turned away in disdain. The sense of betrayal and rejection was palpable, and Harris and Miller found themselves in an ever-deepening state of isolation. For Harris, the fall from grace was particularly stark. Once a respected figure with influence and authority, he now faced an unrelenting struggle to maintain even a semblance of his former life. With his career in law enforcement irreparably damaged, Harris was forced to take on a series of menial and low-paying jobs just to make ends meet. The man who had once wielded power and commanded respect now grappled with the harsh reality of his new circumstances. Each day brought with it a relentless reminder of his lost status and the profound personal and professional setbacks he had endured. Miller, too, encountered a similarly harsh reality. His expertise and skills were primarily limited to law enforcement, leaving him ill-equipped to navigate other fields. As a result, he found himself drifting from one unstable job to another, never able to secure long-term employment or financial stability. The emotional and psychological toll of the scandal took a heavy toll on him, leading to frequent bouts of depression and anger. The public scorn and the weight of his sullied legacy compounded his struggles, creating an environment where hope and resilience seemed increasingly elusive. The disciplinary actions taken against Harris and Miller were more than just punitive measures. They were a clear and forceful statement that such misconduct would not be tolerated. Their downfall acted as a catalyst for significant and far-reaching reforms within the police department. These changes were aimed at addressing and correcting the systemic issues that had previously allowed such egregious behavior to go unchecked. Although Harris and Miller's careers in law enforcement were effectively over, the repercussions of their actions reverberated through the department and beyond. The reforms initiated as a result of their misconduct served as a stark reminder of the critical importance of accountability and the pursuit of justice, ensuring that the lessons learned would have a lasting impact on the institution and its practices for years to come. On a Friday evening, after the events of the day had settled, David joined his mother for a quiet dinner in the comforting embrace of his childhood home. As they took their seats at the table, David's gaze wandered around the familiar surroundings, each corner of the house echoing memories of his upbringing. A deep sense of gratitude welled up within him as he looked at his mother, a woman of extraordinary strength and resilience who had been his unwavering support throughout his life. "Mom," David began, his voice tinged with earnest resolve, "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately. I want to start a community program in your name. This program would be dedicated to promoting respect and equality. We could organize educational workshops, community events, and various initiatives to bring people together and ensure that everyone is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve, just like in the old days." The evening unfolded with heartfelt conversation as they brainstormed ideas for the program. They discussed potential goals, activities, and ways to engage the community effectively. Their dialogue was filled with excitement and a shared vision for creating something meaningful that would honor the values they both cherished. The next morning arrived with a gentle promise of renewal. The air was crisp and filled with the melodic chirping of birds, creating a serene backdrop for the day ahead. Rosa and David found solace on the porch, each holding a steaming cup of coffee. They sat together, basking in the tranquility of the morning, reflecting on their plans with a sense of hope and anticipation for the positive impact their community program could bring. As we reflect on this powerful story, what lessons have resonated with you the most? Share with us in the comments one thing you've learned and how you plan to bring it into practice in your life. We'd love to hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed this video, please leave your comment below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiring content. Thank you for watching.